actually going to now turn everything over. This is Preston. And those of you that didn't get these, you can actually now have these. Preston's going to tell you more about himself, but he is the writer, am I right, Preston, of the book that you are looking at. He is a film, this is, the idea is that this is going to become a film that he's going to tell you about and kind of share the story.
Does anyone not have one?
Everybody get a copy of the book? It's actually a great story, so I'm excited for you guys to hear about it.
Young lady with ponytails. What's your name?
Me?
Yes.
Dasha?
Miss Dasha, could I trouble you to operate the slides? Just you have to use the arrow key to advance. Thank you so much.
You get a raise. All of your life comes to now. This is where you shine.
Okay. Chloe can also.
So, my name's Preston, and I spoke with your rabbi, and I presented with my comic books, and I didn't know, but it turns out he loves comic books, so I twisted his arm, and he allowed me to come in here as long as everybody got a copy. This is the first issue. It's about this woman. You see her on the back. Her name is Lilia Litviak. She was from Poland. She was born in Moscow, and she's the highest-scoring female fighter ace in world history. She shot down 17 Germans like the Soviet Union during the Second World War. And I was fascinated by your story. I thought it would make a great movie, and is now transitioning into a comic book. This is the first issue of 5, which is going to tell her story. So I wanted to come in and present to you guys about that, but Rabbi Marx asked that as part of it, I talk about some of the backdrop for the story, specifically Stalin's treatment of the Jews, which we do kind of reference in the story. So you see, like, they were flashing back to, you know, Litviak's father dying in the Purge, which did happen. She went on to defend the very people who killed her father. It's a story with a fair amount of pain to it. But first I'm going to start talking about my selected topic of this evening. I think I'm slated for an hour. This talk's not going to go nearly that long. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to ask or raise your hand or whatnot. Yeah, Dasha. Can you get this? It's Dasha, right?
Yeah.
Dasha. All right. So here's what you're going to learn tonight. 1. Stalin was deeply suspicious of the Jews. 2. He played upon pre-existing anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, both in his rise to power and throughout his career. And 3. Marxism equates the Jewish faith with capitalism, which led Jewish communists to act against it. Next slide, Don. All right, here's why this matters. In the late 1800s, Russia had the largest Jewish population in the world. And then over the next 100, 150 years, you see comparative populations, Israel 6.4 million Jews, United States anywhere between 5 and 7 million, depending on how you define the term. Today in Russia, only 186,000, Ukraine 63,000, and Poland only 3,200. Next slide. So, first off, why that specific concentrated region? That was where Catherine the Great of Russia defined that Jews had to live under the Pale of Settlement term. And if you went beyond the defined boundaries, you were beyond the Pale, which is the origin of that term. And so you see here in 1905, this was a region which was very concentrated in people of Jewish heritage. So one of the things which Stalin kind of inherited was a tradition of Russian leadership to whip up a lot of anti-Semitism in order to kind of secure their reign. Both Alexander III and Tsars Nicholas II would encourage it through state-funded newspapers, and this would lead to pogroms, which were not state-sanctioned, but nevertheless kind of riotous mobs which were whipped up kind of with a wink and a nod by those in charge to go out and terrorize Jewish communities. Next slide, please. So, the arrow there. There we go. So, this situation was told in Fiddler on the Roof. Has everybody here seen that? No, I figured this community would have seen that. So, pay special attention to the character Perchik, because he tells the story of the left-leaning Jews who were seduced by Marxism and became revolutionaries. Next slide. All right, so the Russian Revolution was underway around 1917. And during the Civil War, a lot of pogroms spontaneously emerged, And these killed a tremendous number of people. In Ukraine, 125,000, and then in Belarus, an additional 25. This drove many Jews into the arms of the revolution. And the revolutionary factions were divided into two. One was the Bolsheviks, which translates, by the way, as the majority, because at the first meeting they had, that was the faction that had the most votes. So the majority, the Bolsheviks, and the Mensheviks, which translates as, what would you guess? The minority. Exactly. All right, next slide. All right, so the General Jewish Labor Bund. This was an organization of left-leaning Jewish intellectuals, all of them socialists, mostly from Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. They would meet, travel around, give talks about how a socialist or communist nation should function. One of the predominant things that this group opposed was Zionism. They said that the idea of immigrating to Palestine was a form of escapism, and they were very much opposed to the Jewish faith. They felt that certain elements of Jewish culture were backwards and reactionary. So this group of intellectuals would go on to permeate the Mensheviks and then also, to a certain extent, the Bolsheviks, and then later they were absorbed in the Communist Party. So whenever I'm referring to Bundes, I'm referring to this group. All right. Next slide. All right, the formation of the RSDLP. The Bund were founding members of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which would later split into two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bundes would mainly side with the Mensheviks, a group founded by two of them, Julius Martov and Pavel Axelrod, with early leadership from Leon Trotsky, who was born Lev Bronstein. Next. All right, the Mensheviks. The Bundes supported this faction, and they sought official recognition of the Jews to have legal status as a protected minority in post-revolutionary Russia. Vladimir Lenin finally rose to lead post-revolutionary Russia with their support by promising to enact the things that they wanted, as well as to pass laws which would bar anti-Semitism. He did. However, anti-Semitism was still very much a part of post-revolutionary Russia, and part of that traces all the way back to the formation of communism and Marxism itself, which who knows who came up with those ideas, or one of the primary proponents. What do you got?
Karl Marx.
Karl Marx, very good. All right, let's go next slide. What did Karl Marx say? Karl Marx wrote, "Money is the jealous god of Israel, in the face of which no other god may exist. And the god of Jews has become secularized and become the god of the world. The bill of exchange is the only real god of the Jews." So they don't want to guess what Karl Marx's heritage was. Hazard a guess? Anyone? Karl Marx was a Jew. Both mother and father from rabbinical lines. So very much of what he was writing was against his own heritage, against his own parentage, against the expectations of his parents to become a rabbi. Next slide. So, Lenin kept his word to the Bundes, and they established, I'm going to mangle some of these pronunciations, but Yevexkia, the Jewish section of the Soviet Communist Party, established in 1918 and then formally disbanded in 1929, run by Stalin and Samuel Gursky, and operated under Vladimir Lenin for the stated purpose of liquidating all Jewish religious institutions. They banned the teaching of Hebrew, they were opposed to Zionism, suppressed religious instruction, abolished Jewish ethnic organization, and banned observance of the Sabbath. Next. All right, so there are three main figures that we're going to focus on going through the Russian Revolution. First is Vladimir Lenin. He favored the vision of socialism in one country over Trotsky's call for a worldwide socialist revolution. He suffered a stroke in 1922, which would force him into reclusion. And he grew increasingly critical of Stalin's power and wrote that the leadership of the country should go to Trotsky. Next slide. Keep up. All right. Leon Trotsky. He turned down the post of commissar in 1917, which Lenin offered him, because he didn't want to embolden the enemies of the Soviet Union by saying that the country was run by a Jew. This post was instead given to Stalin, which paved the way for his rise to power. Trotsky would become a political rival to Joseph Stalin, who would increasingly use anti-Semitic rhetoric in his speeches against him. And now let's talk about the man of steel himself. Next slide. All right, Joseph Stalin. He was born with this very complicated name that I'm not even going to attempt, and he adopted, because of his political ambitions, the much simpler name Joseph Stalin. Does anyone know what that means? It actually translates as Joe Steel. That was his name. So in Russia, the man of steel refers to someone entirely different than if we were to talk about it in the United States, where we would refer to Superman. So he was the son of a drunkard father who lost his business and abused his family, and his mother, an occasional prostitute. Because Stalin went on to kill so many people, there's been a lot of kind of delving into his psyche, and it's thought that his father would go out and borrow money from people in order to get drunk, and that's part of how he lost his business, and who would he have been borrowing money from? But this is probably one of the formations of very early in Stalin's formation, very deep anti-Semitism. He was also rather self-conscious. He didn't get a formal education, and most people didn't think of him as very bright. People would often criticize him as kind of dumb, and he had kind of a low-sloped forehead, which he was very self-conscious about. That's why he was always photographed wearing a hat. Next picture. All right, so Lenin establishes the secret police, or Chechka. It was first led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, who said that Chechka is not a court. We stand for organized terror. It is obligated to defend the revolution and conquer the enemy, even if the sword does by chance fall on the heads of the innocent. So from very early on, they had understood this was a terror organization. It was dictated to carry out the ideas of Lenin and Trotsky, who called for the extermination of the bourgeois, which was a term Marx invented to come up with essentially the middle or upper class. A disproportionate number of Jews would join the secret police and would continue to work under them even during the anti-Jewish campaigns of 1948 to 1953. Next slide. All right, so this woman, Dora Kaplan, a Jew and revolutionary, shot Lenin in an attempt to assassinate him on August 30th, 1918. The Chechnya responded by interrogating and executing roughly 10,000 people, most of whom were Jews. Next slide. Lenin's criticism of Stalin. As we know from the prior slide, Lenin suffered a stroke in 1922, and he had to convalesce. He lost the ability to speak for a time, but he started writing. And what he wrote was that Stalin, as well as other members of the Communist Party, were unfit for the positions they held, they were mad with power, they were abusing it, and that they should be removed from their position, and instead it should be given to Trotsky. Upon his death, this testament was presented to the ruling triumvirate, which included Joseph Stalin, and they all agreed to suppress it, since Lenin's testament was critical of all three of them. Next slide. So Trotsky, after Stalin came to power, led the united opposition, or left opposition to Stalin's regime, which Stalin characterized in increasingly anti-Semitic terms. After Lenin's testament was published in the United States, Stalin pressured Trotsky to write an article refuting its legitimacy, which he did. Trotsky was ultimately forced into exile in 1928, which began an ideological cleansing of Stalin's political opponents, eventually leading to the Great Purge 10 years later. Trotsky would ultimately be killed in exile. Next picture. Another slide. This was an event which happened to Ukrainians, which my comic focuses on two people. We have Lilia Litviak, who's from Poland, and also her wingman, Katya Budanova. Together they are the two highest scoring female combat pilots in world history. And Katya, in my comic, was Ukrainian. And the Ukrainians didn't necessarily have a pleasant run with things either. They wanted to have their own regime, not necessarily to revolt against communism, but to nevertheless have their own government and to be free from Soviet control. And Stalin did not respond well to that. So he engineered a famine in 1932 to 33 that killed somewhere between 2 to 5 million people. Next slide. Thank you. And now we come to the Great Purge, which was launched in 37 and continued through 38, which would kill 500,000 Soviet citizens. It did not target Jews specifically, but many of them would die nonetheless under charges of being associated with Trotsky, because again, going back to the Bundists were a group of Jews to begin with. So many of these intellectuals would be targeted as political rivals for Stalin. Anyone who's expressing any favoritism towards Zionism, and again, anyone who showed any preference towards the Jewish faith would be targeted because under Karl Marx, the Jewish faith was tantamount to capitalism, which was an enemy. In 1928, Stalin designated part of Siberia, little part right here, as a Jewish homeland, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. And to this day, it is one of the two designated Jewish homelands in the world. He would start to deport or encourage many Jews to settle there. It's not nearly as nice as Israel being in Siberia, so it wasn't nearly successful. Next slide. Stalin, as we all probably know, made a pact with Hitler. In leading up to that, he appointed Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to purge the Ministry of Jews in order to appeal Hitler and to signal to Nazi Germany that the USSR was ready for a non-aggression pact. Molotov, by the way, you ever heard of Molotov cocktail? Yeah. That was named after this guy. So after this non-aggression pact was formed, Russia invaded Finland. And the Finns would throw, basically these homemade grenades onto Russian tanks or Russian advancing forces, and part of their taunts was, cheers to Comrade Molotov, so they became known as Molotov cocktails. The Soviet Union joined Germany in the invasion of Poland. The Jewish Poles fled Nazi-occupied Western Poland to Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland, and Stalin's forces would execute as many as class enemies and would deport an additional 300,000 Jews from Soviet-occupied Poland to the JAO region referenced on the last slide. Ironically, this would save this group of people, because later when the Nazis invaded Western Russia, they were safe, relatively safe in Siberia. In total, over 1.5 million Poles would be deported to the Soviet Union, where they would die in labor camps in Siberia. All right. Stalin failed to warn the Jewish people that were under Soviet control. Per the terms of the pact with Hitler, the Soviet press suppressed information about the Nazi extermination, and this policy would continue even after Germany invaded. Here's a report from the Wehrmacht, 1941. The Jews are strikingly ill-informed about our attitudes towards them and about the treatment Jews are receiving in Germany or Warsaw. Although they do not expect to be granted equal rights with the Russians under the German administration, they do believe they will be left alone if they apply themselves diligently to their work. Next slide. There was even one incident in the small town of Karatsicha, which was near Kiev, where elders of the Jewish settlement went out to meet the invading Nazis with kind of the traditional peace offering of bread and salt. During the German occupation, the Soviet press would mischaracterize what the SS was doing and label these casualties as either Poles or Ukrainians. Ultimately, the Germans would exterminate 2 of the 5 million Jews living in the Soviet Union. All right. Russia essentially reached an amnesty agreement with the Polish government, which was in exile in London because Poland was occupied at the time, during which they would release Poles who were being imprisoned simply because they were Poles, as long as they would agree to join the war effort, which is something that plays into my character, Lilia, because she is from Poland. And so this is part of why she's being drafted in the Soviet Air Force, is under this amnesty. Next. All right, the formation of the JAC. Going back to Stalin and his love of hats and not being very sensitive about his intellect. You see what happens when somebody comes up with a good idea. So this idea stemmed from 2 Bundists, Henrik Ehrlich and Victor Alter, who achieved some level of prominence in international politics. They were captured when the Soviets invaded Poland. They were moved to a Moscow jail where they were interrogated by the secret police and ultimately released under that amnesty I talked about on the last slide. They wanted to work with the Russians against the Germans, so they came up with an idea. They authored a report and sent it to Stalin and said, hey, why don't we get together a bunch of prominent Jewish figures and form the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee? We'll tour, we'll meet with the Allies, and we'll drum up support against the Germans. Stalin wrote 2 words on the cover: shoot them. But he liked the idea. Next slide. So, after their deaths, he would go on to actually do it. He would form the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and it would spread news of German atrocities abroad in order to generate another front for the war against Germany. He would never allow these reports of these atrocities to be told in the Soviet Union while the war was going on. All right, so after the war, we get the formation of Israel, which Stalin initially supported, but soon became very concerned because of the calls for Jewish nationalism, which it engendered. Israel established an embassy in the Soviet Union, and Golda Meir, who's Ukrainian, was the first ambassador. Any Soviet Jew who wrote a letter to the Israeli embassy asking if they might or how they might become a transplant to Israel would be arrested by the secret police, and many of them go. Next slide. So, Golda Meir attended services at the Moscow Choral Synagogue, where she was mobbed by tens of thousands of Russian Jews chanting her name. That little circle is Golda Meir amongst the sea of people chanting for her. And this set Stalin off, because again, what did Stalin hate more than anything but calls for nationalism? We saw how he responded with the Ukrainians. So he decided he was going to have to deal with this once and for all. Next slide. All right, he established a new purge specifically to target Jewish culture. And the first targets were the people who helped him win the Second World War, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Every person who was an active member of that was either arrested or killed. Yiddish theaters were closed, newspapers, schools, and publishing houses were closed, and during the night of August 12th to the 13th, 1952, remembered as the Night of the Murdered Poets, 13 of the most prominent Yiddish writers of the Soviet Union were executed on orders from Stalin. Amongst the victims were Perez Markish, David Bergelson, and Itzhak Befer. And then we hatched the Doctor's Plot. On January 13, 1953, the Soviet Union's information agency announced the unmasking of a conspiracy of doctor poisoners who had covertly attempted to decapitate Soviet leadership. They accused the doctors were all senior physicians, most of them Jewish, who had allegedly confessed to planning and successfully carrying out heinous assassinations, including the covert murders of such high-profile Soviet citizens as writer Alexander Sherbatov and politician Andrei Zadanov. So they're putting out this notion that Jews at the highest level, the doctors, are there poisoning people. And many people are suspicious of doctors anyway. You go in, they got the white coat, they're injecting you with stuff, who knows? So they put out this notion that the Jews are attempting to kill you. The Jewish doctors, it was called the Doctor's Plot. Next slide. All right. And this was to be the start of a new great terror. There were concentration camps built in Siberia at the JAC to house a tremendous number of people, and an open letter was prepared by the Soviet government, which was to be published on the cover of Pravda. This letter was going to be from Jewish intellectuals and Jewish leaders, but it was written by the Soviet government. And it called for, asked Stalin to respond to these waves of anti-Semitism sweeping the nation by deporting Jewish populations to Siberia purportedly for their own good. This most likely was to be the start of a new terror aimed specifically at the eradication of the Jewish element. Next slide. But Stalin dies while he unveiled the plan. In a meeting at the Presidium at Kremlin in 1953, Stalin revealed details of his plan to combat a sinister Zionist and imperialist plot. Vashev Molotov, who, going back, he was the guy who helped Stalin purge Jews from the Russian government in order to reach a pact with Hitler. His wife was a Jew and was sent to Siberia, never to come back. So he spoke up in opposition to the plan. He'd had enough. And he was joined by this man, Clement Vorshilov, who had to defend his Jewish wife with a pistol from arrest just days earlier, and he threw his party membership card on the table and saying he could no longer support the party. And Stalin was enraged. His blood pressure shot through the roof. He suffers a stroke and collapses, thus ending the Doctor's Plot as well as the plan to deport possibly millions of people to Siberia. So that is the backdrop of this comic book, which takes place entirely in World War II. So, next slide. One of the things I've asked is, there were a few changes I made in the story, which I'm going to go with you, but I asked our artistic team to stick as closely as possible to how these people actually looked. So this is an actual picture of Lydia Litviak, and this is our comic rendering of her. She tended to have brown hair. She peroxided it, so it ends up being kind of blonde, but it's darker at the roots, which is why we gave her these dark eyebrows. Historically, she was born in Moscow to two Polish parents, but because I wanted to be able to talk about all the historical elements, I changed that historical fact to have her instead be born in Poland, so that I could talk about the amnesty, and also going back to the suppression of information about what was going on, what the Germans were doing to the Jews. If I made her, as she was, from Moscow, she wouldn't know about what was going on to her own people, but being from Poland, she would. So this allows me, through the story, to talk about what was going on. Next slide. This is Lilia, and this is Tatya Budanova, who's right here. And again, these are the two highest scoring female fighter pilots in history. She shot down about 17 Germans. She shot down about 12. They were in divisions which were set up by, next slide, this woman, who's known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, Marina Raskova. She set the record for long-distance navigation or aerial navigation, and ultimately died in 1943 during a training exercise. So I'm going to go through the opening few pages of the comic book and kind of talk about how I was able to incorporate the history into the comic. Before I continue on, does anyone have any questions? Okay, cool. All right. So this is the cover. I ended up using Lilia twice. Later on in the story, she gets shot down over Stalingrad, so here she is hiding. Lilia would fall in love with this man historically. His name was Alexei Solomatin. They fell in love. They were engaged to be married until one day he would crash and die right in front of her, which would cause her to snap. She then volunteered for a series of increasingly dangerous missions. So, next slide. All right, so one of the things that the Bolsheviks or Russian revolutionaries would do is exterminate the bourgeoisie. So our story opens, and she's living in a mansion because they killed all the rich people. But this has been converted to tenement housing. So you see our mansion is kind of run down. This is, by the way, this opening page right there. So our mansion has become run down. You see the clock is broken. The walls are coming off. And an air raid is what has awakened her. Lilia probably smoked. One of the things that I wanted to show is Lilia has this kind of driving death instinct because she keeps volunteering to be in increasingly dangerous missions. She very much seemed to want to go out in a blaze of glory as kind of a war hero. So I portray her with this. The first thing you see of her is her lighting up the cigarette. So, next slide. Then she walks out front. We meet her, Lilia Litviak, flight instructor, and this is kind of the Battle of Moscow. She's out. She's surveying what's going on. She expresses her need for coffee. Next slide. And we can see that this is Moscow and the war, and she's wishing people good luck. One of the nice things about comics is you can kind of see their interior thoughts, so we can see her interior thoughts are very dark, which we're kind of understanding where she's coming from because of who she is. Next slide. But nevertheless, she ignores the air raid. She goes to her coffee shop where she gets some coffee. They're joking about him being a capitalist because he's there preparing pastries while they should be hiding, and he's going to have a monopoly on things. And then she comes out and she looks up, and lo and behold, the Germans actually are bombing. She tells Victor to run. Next slide. Big explosion. I love the way they rendered the artwork on this one. And then she looks out, and poor Victor is dead. And this was, I wanted to kind of express what must have been going on for her, because death, for so many people, was just something that they constantly lived with. And so in order to get into that mindset, this is how I opened my story. Next slide. Then we meet Katya, who's kind of coming out of a bomb shelter, and she's giving Izvestia, which is a newspaper. There were two main papers in Russia. There was Izvestia, which simply meant the news, and there was Pravda, which simply meant the truth. So she gives away her copy of Izvestia, and then meets up with Lilia, who's talking about the bombing of her coffee shop, and Katya is dusting her off. And Lilia offers her the coffee and doesn't tell Katya the story behind this, because I'm trying to portray that this character has her pain all internalized. But we know what's going on with that coffee thermos as she gives it away. Next slide. So they're joking here that Katya's like, oh, I just read in the newspaper that Marina Raskova is setting up these 3 divisions for women pilots. And this was an actual saying, because there were 2 newspapers. There was the news and there was the truth, and there was the cynical Russian saying of, there is no news in the truth and no truth in the news. So they're kind of saying that as they go out and they start instructing pilots. They were functioning as flight instructors. And these are Po-2 biplanes, which is what they would have been instructing them in. Next slide. Now, one of the things you'll notice is I actually change the orientation as we go up in the air. So you see, here we are, and we go up in the air, and you actually have to tilt the book like that. And the reason I did that is because I'm trying to answer the question of why she sacrificed so much of herself and continued to put herself in danger to defend a country they clearly had no love for. And so one of the ways I answer that question is to show that up in the sky, she's free, she's powerful, it's big, it's vast, and it's different. And in orienting the book, you actually get the feeling of a pilot, because one of the things you have to do as a pilot is you have to get your wings level with the horizon. And so when you go up in the sky, you have to physically orient the book with the horizon. So this was something I borrowed from the Night Witches of Bombers. They're getting buzzed by this Messerschmitt 110 heavy fighter, which had a stall speed of like 110 miles an hour, and they're flying in this biplane, which only goes like 30, 40 miles an hour tops. And so one of the things the Russian women would do is they would pull these tight little circles, because the other fighters were much faster and they couldn't pull the tight little circles with them. And she's flipping them off, which is an American gesture. I understand that. I was appealing to an American audience. She wouldn't have really done that because that's not a Russian gesture, nor is it a Polish gesture, but I thought it was pretty cute. So, next slide. Anyway, she comes back to the ground, and now they have to go home. Both Katya and Lilia have received notice that they're being inducted into the Soviet Air Force and have to make this journey home. And unlike where the sky, where we've got these big wide panels, and on the ground these tight claustrophobic panels, and we color-coded them so that we could see these are Lilia's experiences here, these are Katya's experiences here, but they're having very much the same journey. They're traveling home, they're meeting with their mothers because their fathers are dead. And what do we have? We have a Polish mother and a Ukrainian mother, both of whom experienced horrible injustice from the Soviet Union, and neither one are particularly thrilled that their daughters are going to defend it. Then we get this swearing-in service, where they're presenting their letters. I get this part right here, where this was a real woman, by the way, Tamara Kausranova. And she's saying, well, you're from Poland. You should be particularly motivated to go avenge the German invaders. And of course, she has a response, as opposed to the Soviet invaders, because you now know the history behind that. And then we have this oath that they're taking. This oath was written by Stalin, and it is word for word translated and depicted here. So everything you see written is what they had to swear to. And you see, it just goes on. They keep having to swear as we, next panel, or next page. It's just going on, solemnly vow to be an honest, brave, disciplined, vigilant fighter, to strictly guard all state and secrets, and implicitly all da-da-da. And we're kind of going into these flashback sequences. So we see Katya growing up on this farm, and her love of aviation. As there's a biplane up there, she runs in, she gets the torch, she comes out, she waves. We understand why Katya loves to fly. And then next page, we now go back to Lilia. And again, what happened with her father? Her father was killed as an enemy of the people in 1938. So we see this flashback. Commissar, superiors, I vow to study the duties of the soldier and consistently safeguard army and national property every way possible, and to be true to the people, my Soviet mother, and the workers and peasants' government to my dying breath. That was the actual oath they had to take, and we're artistically using it. We're showing her father being led to the gallows. She charges, she's struck, and then her father's hanging body defending to her dying breath. So kind of a juxtaposition of the oath they were having to take with the flashbacks of what was going on. So we're able to see the internal struggle that she's going through, and why she's so angry here, and why ultimately she storms out after she's been inducted in the Soviet Air Force. So those are the opening few pages of my comic book about these two. I've got a Kickstarter going on right now. I'd love to collect email addresses in order to get anyone's support, and I'm here to answer any questions you might have.
Are you the only artist?
No, I can't draw at all.
Oh.
I am what's termed the creator. So I researched and wrote the story. Then I picked the artistic team. So artistically, this goes through a 4-step process. First, a penciler has to sketch out everything. Then an inker comes over the top and fills in everything that's not going to be colored. So the inker, this is all ink in here and on here. And if you go back slide, see the inker inked all this but left this blank, so the colors could come in and add the color. So first penciling, then inking, then the colorist. Now the penciling and the inking these days are still done by hand, going all the way back to animation, or these days animation, everything's done by hand. But color mostly is done these days in Photoshop. You can still have it done by hand, but that's more expensive. So after it's inked, it's kind of scanned into a computer, and this is all the colors added in Adobe Photoshop. And then lettering. Jack, you want to talk about lettering?
Delighted. Yes, it's more of a craft than it is an art. But the letterist, the letterer guides the eye across the page with the letters, so he's able to direct attention to things, direct attention away from things. But the primary thing he's aiming for is clarity. You can see that we have the oath scrolling across this page, for example. So we want to show this is still going, while at the same time directing your attention mainly to the middle of the page where she's talking about her father, which is the subject of this page. And if you move on to the next page, you can see, thank you, Dasha, you can see how we're communicating that she's shouting in one. We have a thought balloon in the next saying, what's going on, what's she doing? And then we are able to communicate what the people are saying, what they're thinking, and the order of events as we go from panel to panel. Any questions on lettering?
I have a question. How long did it take you to complete the whole comic?
Well, it took me, after I chose the artistic team, it has to be done in stages. So first, all the penciling has to be done. Then the inkers will kind of do that, and then the colors will do that. Now, if I was running a big house like Marvel or DC, and I had these people on staff, they could probably crank this out in a week or two. But I'm using people who, are doing great work, and largely they were fitting this in when they weren't doing work for the big publishing houses. So this took to do that entire book that you have in your hands, took about 6 to 8 months for the artist to turn it around.
What about your research and writing?
That took a couple of years. The history you can easily assimilate if you just research, read a few books, read Wikipedia articles. But I have to take it and I have to craft it into a narrative that people are going to find engaging. Otherwise, you just end up with a documentary. So I had to take it, I had to focus it down, and that process took, a good year and a half. So I guess about 2 years altogether to come up with the story. Yes, Don?
What inspired you to want to create this comic?
Well, I learned about her in a Google search for a punchline of a joke my dad told me when I was a kid. The joke's a little risque, so I probably shouldn't say it here. But one of the words in the joke was the word Messerschmitt. So I typed in the punchline of the joke, these guys was flying Messerschmitts, and this woman's picture came up. This picture here that's on the back, that one, came up, and it showed a picture of a Messerschmitt and said that this was one of the first kills she ever got. And so I clicked on the article on Wikipedia, and it talks about this woman fighter pilot, and I was amazed. I didn't know women ever were fighter pilots, except until very recently, but not in World War II, but they were. This was, the Soviet Union used female fighter pilots, and I had no idea. I thought this woman's story was fascinating. The first kill she got was this German named Mayer, who was an ace, and he was shot down, and he was actually captured by the Soviets, and he asked to be taken in front of the Soviet pilot that shot him down. So they bring her in front of Lilia, and he says, "You're playing a trick on me. There's no way a woman could have shot me down." And she recounts their air-to-air combat right up to the moment she shoots him down, and then he realizes, I really have been bested by a woman. I thought this was an amazing story. And all her decision to fight against, the German forces, who were horrible, but also to defend a state that also wasn't showing her any love, was a very complex decision. In a lot of ways, it's some that, we're still kind of haunted with today. And I thought, this story speaks to me, it's going to speak to other people, so that's why I decided to do my best to bring it about. Yes?
Wait, so you said there are going to be 5 books, right?
There are going to be 5 books.
Are they going to be about the same person?
Yeah, it's going to be the same person. Yes.
And how much will each one of these cost, like the next ones?
I'm pricing these at $5.
Can you afford that? Okay, why a comic book?
Well, it started as a screenplay, as Lori mentioned. And I was convinced that Hollywood was going to love this story. But they had 3 main criticisms. One, there's no American in the story. And one of the things they're like, well, where's the American? Well, there isn't one. And there's not an Asian either. And those are the 2 big markets for movies. It's the US market and the Chinese market. And they're looking, ethnically, there's no overlap here. These are all about Russians and Ukrainians. There's no American point of view, there's no Asian point of view, so they're worried about how they're gonna do in those markets. 2, we have 2 female leads, which is viewed as risky. So essentially, the way Hollywood would look at it is we've taken the story Enemy at the Gate, I don't know, do you know that one? The sniper movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, and instead of Jude Law, we now have 2 women, and so that's viewed as a risky move. And it's not like Enemy at the Gate was setting the world on fire at the box office anyway. And there's a third issue, it slips my mind. But one of the ways that I felt I could prove it to them is if I created a comic book and it developed a following. And also, I feel that because movies are very visual, if I'm able to present to investors kind of this visual layout of the story, they're able to, you know, to see the movie in their minds a lot easier than if I presented words on the page.
Your third issue is period piece,
Oh yeah, also it's a period piece, which
More-
Hollywood hates period pieces.
more expensive.
Yeah.
Any questions?
So can you just, so you said there are gonna be how many books?
5.
5 books.
Yeah, I took my screenplay and I chopped it up into 5 pieces.
And so where will those books be when they're released?
Well, ultimately, they'll ultimately be combined into a graphic novel, so you'll have the entire story in one piece. But I have to pay the artists. They don't work for free. So in breaking it up into these bite-sized pieces, I'm able to go and create it and present it and sell it and get my money back and then fund the next book and the next book and so on in order to get it created. Go ahead.
Do you have like a favorite like scene or part of any of the books that you found like, or like any of the books you would think have like the most interesting, like you're just your favorite part of the story?
My favorite part is the ending.
Don't spoil it.
Yeah. It's just, hate to give away the story here, but these 2 women died. They died at the Battle of Kursk. And Lilia died 2 weeks shy of her 21st birthday. So there was so much life crammed into a woman who wasn't even 21 years of age. So what I did was, are you familiar with the story, the Great Gatsby? Yeah. One of the interesting things about that story is usually our protagonist, that's the person who's driving the action, the person who's doing things, opposing people, is your main character. But that's not so in the Great Gatsby. We actually have a main character who's kind of boring, Nick Carraway, who's our narrator, and he's kind of observing everything. He's going to Gatsby's parties, he's present when Gatsby's attempting to woo Daisy and all that stuff. So we have a guy reporting on the action, and we have our protagonist. And I thought that would be a great structure, because we can have Katya, who's my main character. She's observing Lilia. She was observing her drive. And the story I kept having to try and answer with Lilia is, why would this woman fight so hard to defend a nation that was killing her own people? And I thought every time I answered that question, I came up with a few answers. I'm like, well, you know, she wanted to go out in a blaze of glory so the next time a purge came down, her family would be protected. But every time I answered that question, I found it kind of diminished my opinion of the character. I'm like, you know what? What if I'm in Katya's head the whole time and she's attempting to answer that question for herself? So what I did was I have Katya, who's kind of having this, you know, mostly in her head, lesbian infatuation with Lilia, which allows me to talk about the fact that homosexuality was against the rules of the Soviet Union. That was another one-way ticket to Siberia, never to return. So she's in love with Lilia, who's in love with Alexei, and then when Alexei dies, Lilia's diving headlong into the war, and Kai is attempting to kind of heal her. And ultimately, this leads to the Battle of Kursk, where historically, the way Lilia died was she was shot, her fighter was streaming, it disappears behind the cloud, and they don't find her. Her body was not recovered until 1979, still in her fighter plane. And so, because she was just absent, nobody knew. Maybe she was captured by the Nazis. There was one story that maybe she ran off to the United States. I mean, nobody knew. That's part of the reason why she wasn't made a hero of the Soviet Union until the 80s with Mikhail Gorbachev. So, we're in Katya's head. Lilia's gone. She doesn't know where she is. She's hoping that she's going to find her again. And I, as the writer, am encouraging that, because this is an action movie. And one of the things we know about action movies, one of the things we've been conditioned by Hollywood, is to believe that these characters are going to come back and a happy ending. And so we're there with Katya's delusion when she's thinking, you're going to come back to me, I'm going to find you. And then we go into the final dogfight with Katya. She finds the guy who shot down Lilia. She bests him in this dogfight, but she's mortally wounded. Her plane is smoking. She crashes, And there, taped to her dashboard, is the White Lily. By the way, the reason it's called White Lily is because that was her aviator call sign. Like, you know, Maverick and Top Gun or something. That was the aviator call sign that Lily went by. And according to legend, she painted a big white lily on the side of the plane. And there, taped to her dashboard, is her White Lily. And she's kind of stroking it when, you know, the blood and the oil is getting on it as she dies. And that's the close of the picture. And there we realize in the final moment, oh my God, they're both dead. And it kind of sneaks up on you in this emotional moment that gets me weepy, so I'm not going to talk. Go ahead.
If both characters are dead, then what are you gonna add in the other 4 books?
They don't die until book 5. You see, at the end of book 1, they just want vodka.
Oh,
It's a quick story.
got it, okay.
You see, I tell my story in 5 pieces. It's going to take 110 to 115 pages. This book's only 22. So 5 is going to be 110.
Well, we look forward to seeing the 5th book.
Hopefully it's not as graphic as Dog's Media was. It was, I don't know what it is about a medic guy in Japan or something. It was really recent.
Silence?
Yeah, Hacksaw Ridge.
Oh, Hacksaw Ridge.
I hope it's not, hopefully.
Well, part of the beauty
hopefully it's not
of
as
dealing with airplanes is a lot of the violence is off screen.
Yes.
You know, you shoot them, they fall out of the sky. It's not nearly as bloody. So.
Can they, is there somewhere where if they want to learn more or keep up with you, they can, a website?
Sure. Well, one of the things I'm collecting email addresses. I have these wonderful Soviet-era replica pens. Just put down your email address here, and I will send you updates every time I'm doing something, or giving an appearance, or a comic show, or
Cool.
whatnot.
So if you would like to leave your emails, you can do so there. Thank you so much. This is like, I think this is really interesting. We really enjoyed this. So thank you. It is almost 7:30. I'm gonna go grab some cookies. You can all come grab dessert. Leave your emails if you would like. And
That was the I already read the book. Yeah, I already read it.
Yeah, the letter was missing.
It's so silent.
Thank you so much, Dasha.
Oh, you're welcome.
That one, it does say Victor. So there used to be more writing on this page, as you saw from that slide. That was his decision taken on the last camp. He felt that the artwork kind of spoke for itself.
oh shoot.
Wait for what?
The explosion.
Sound of.
Oh, yeah.
Because the slide I had here was from a prior version, and she's saying "yeah," and so.
Also, he put down this big explosion, sound balloons. And
Right.
so forth. You know, it's very 60s Batman, pow, biff stuff. That's not what we're doing. It's more serious.
I thank you. And feel free to. All right. Well, hopefully people like it.